I was unwinding at my waterfront condo when, at 5 a.m., the security alarm blared. The guard called shaking, "Your sister is here with movers. She says you must move out. Claims she owns the place." I took a slow sip of coffee and smiled. Let her in. She's about to discover what I just did. I woke up that morning to a sharp, insistent beeping that sliced through the dark. It was the building security alarm, the kind that only goes off when someone's trying to force their way in, or just insisting. For a moment, I just lay there, staring at the faint outline of my ceiling in my waterfront condo, the automatic blinds slowly rising to reveal a thin ribbon of dawn. That constant, piercing alarm just kept going. Then my phone vibrated. It was Trent from security, and his voice? Shaking. I'd never heard him like that. He said my sister Lydia and her husband, Bronson, were in the lobby. With a moving truck. Insisting they owned my place. Insisting I come down immediately and leave, because they were taking possession today. For a few seconds, I couldn't say anything. There was something so surreal about hearing my life described as if it were already over. But then, a calm I hadn't felt in months settled over me. I told Trent it was fine. "Let them sign in," I said. Then I wheeled myself to the kitchen, grabbed the cold coffee I'd left out, and took a slow sip. It was bitter, but it grounded me. That sip held the same kind of steady focus I used to feel before a high-pressure briefing, back when I worked for the Bureau, before the accident. Before my legs stopped working and my whole life turned upside down. Outside, the harbor was silver and quiet, boats rocking gently, completely oblivious to the fact that my entire world was about to shatter, or so they thought. You know, I always wonder where people are when they listen to stories like mine. Maybe you're driving to work, or folding laundry, or sitting with your own cup of coffee as the sun comes up. For me, that morning, I was sitting in my wheelchair near the open blinds, feeling the chill from the glass doors, trying to wrap my head around how my own sister could show up before dawn, with a moving truck. I have a live feed from the lobby camera on my phone. I tapped it open and watched. Lydia stepped inside, her arms crossed tightly, looking smaller than I remembered. Like she'd folded in on herself. Next to her, Bronson, calm as still water, tapping a folder against his leg. Behind them, two men in navy shirts stood by a bright white moving truck, looking half awake, half confused. They were there because they were being paid, nothing more. Trent approached them, and even without sound, I could tell he was trying to explain protocol. Asterisk residents don't lose ownership overnight. Possession isn't transferred because someone shows up with a truck. Asterisk the movers kept glancing at Bronson's folder like it was some golden ticket. Lydia rubbed her forehead and looked toward the elevators, expecting me to just appear. Watching them on screen, I felt incredibly calm. Not numb, not detached, just steady. This was it. This was the moment everything had led to. The subtle lies. The little stories whispered about my memory lapses. Neighbors asking if I was doing okay, or if it was true I shouted from nightmares. Lydia's voice trembling as she suggested managing my finances. At the time, they felt strange, but not alarming. No. Now they lined up perfectly, like pieces of a puzzle I hadn't known I was solving. The camera shifted, and I saw Bronson turn to Lydia, touching her elbow gently. To anyone else, it would look caring. But I knew better. That touch had purpose. Manipulators always cloak control in gentleness. His jaw was tight, his eyes flicking toward the elevator. Whatever he'd been planning, this was supposed to be his victory lap. He thought he'd outsmarted me. He thought I'd crumble. I took another sip of cold coffee, letting the bitterness settle. There was something almost poetic about watching them stand there, in my building, waiting to take away the home that had become my lifeline. I had rebuilt myself in this condo. I'd learned how to move through pain, how to breathe when anxiety gripped my ribs so tightly I thought they might crack. I'd cried in that living room, laughed on that balcony. This space had held my broken pieces until I could put myself back together. And here they were, believing that with one morning surprise, they could erase me. I set my cup down, rolled closer to the window. The sun was fully rising, turning the harbor bright gold. This wasn't a crisis. This was the opening act of a story I'd already prepared for. They were walking straight into a plan I'd finished just yesterday. Every detail arranged. Every document secured. Every piece of evidence gathered. They had no idea. Trent looked up toward the camera, his shoulders lifting, a silent question. Asterisk, should I stall them? Call the police? Asterisk, I didn't need any of that. I opened the microphone to his station and spoke clearly. Let them in, I said. Allow them to write their names in the visitor log. I want everything documented. Every step recorded. When I ended the connection, the condo felt strangely quiet. The alarm had stopped. The blinds were open. The gentle clink of halyards against masts drifted up from the marina. I sat there, hands on my chair wheels, breathing evenly. They didn't know what I had done yesterday, and they were about to learn. Before that morning in the lobby, before the moving truck and the cold coffee and the calm in my chest that even surprised me, there was another version of me. One I still sometimes search for in the dark. Back in 2019, I wasn't the woman in a wheelchair in a San Diego waterfront condo. I was running on adrenaline and coffee, chasing shadows for the bureau, untangling threats before they hit the news. My days were briefings, field reports, coded conversations. I had a body that did what I asked and a mind that believed it could outrun anything. People imagine accidents as one dramatic impact. The truth is, the moment that changed everything for me started small. A strange pattern in financial records, a familiar name on an unfamiliar list. A lead that looked like nothing, then refused to go away. We followed it into a late-night surveillance op that should have been straightforward. It wasn't. I remember pieces. The wet pavement. Headlights cutting across the median. The sickening feeling when another vehicle came out of nowhere, running from a different crime, intersecting with ours in the worst possible way. The world tilted. Metal screamed. Glass rained down in tiny, cold stars. Then, nothing. When I woke up in the hospital, drugs softening the edges, I learned they almost lost me. Then, that I would live, but my legs would never again carry me. My spine had paid the price. Rehab. Chairs. Limits I'd never imagined. The bureau did what it could. Medals. Handshakes. Words about service and sacrifice. Eventually, a settlement. A carefully calculated number for the monetary value of my lost mobility, my altered future. $2 million in insurance compensation. On top of that, donations poured in from people who'd read about the injured agent. It was touching, overwhelmingly so. I didn't grow up with that kind of money. My childhood was modest. Mom and Dad kept the lights on, the fridge never completely empty. They gave us love when there wasn't much else. Then, in 2010, a drunk driver crossed a line he shouldn't have, and my world split again. Mom and Dad were there one moment, gone the next. No lingering illness, no gentle fade, just a phone call, a crash, and silence. I was 17. Lydia was 11, with wide eyes and a laugh that burst out of her without warning. The state could have stepped in. Guardianships, foster care. All the careful phrases systems use. I looked at Lydia and knew there was no way I was letting her be raised by strangers. So I did what I've always done. I made a plan. I worked. I studied. I took care of bills while other kids went to high school dances. Sometimes, late at night, doing homework after putting Lydia to bed, the weight of it all would hit me. This role I never asked for. Then I'd wipe my face, finish my assignments, and wake up to do it again. Becoming an agent felt like a natural extension of that. I was good at carrying burdens quietly, at watching instead of speaking, at seeing the lines people drew and the ones they tried to cross. Training was grueling, but it was almost a relief to face challenges with structure, rules, clear objectives. When I joined counterintelligence, I thought I'd finally turned all that early responsibility into purpose. The accident didn't just break my spine. It broke that sense of certainty. After months in rehab, learning to transfer from bed to chair, navigate ramps, and how strangers avoided my eyes, I had to make another decision. I couldn't stay in a city where every corner reminded me of the life I'd lost. I needed somewhere that felt like air again. Somewhere my lungs could expand without bumping into old ghosts. San Diego ended up on my list because of one simple thing: the ocean. I'd visited once as a teenager, a 3-day trip with Mom and Dad that lived in my memory like a treasure. The salty sweet air. The sun slipping into the water like it was going to bed. When I received the final paperwork for my settlement, I sat with it spread out on the table and thought about where a woman like me could rebuild. The answer kept turning back to that coastline. I used part of the settlement to buy a small one-bedroom condo at Harborline Towers, overlooking the marina. It wasn't extravagant, but to me, it felt like a palace. Ramps, elevators, security staff who learned my name quickly. The first night I slept there, propped on pillows with the sliding door open just enough to let in the sound of the water, I cried quietly. Not entirely from sadness. It was grief and gratitude, tangled together. Lydia visited often in those first months. She'd arrive with takeout, new plants, and stories about her job as an event planner's assistant. She had a knack for describing people, and I'd listen as she talked about impossible brides and corporate clients. We'd sit on the balcony, my chair angled to see the horizon, her legs tucked underneath her on the outdoor sofa. Sometimes she'd go quiet, looking at my chair, then away. That hurt, but it was honest. We'd both lost something in my accident. The sister she'd known, the one who could chase her around the yard, was gone. In her place was a woman who still teased her, but now had to ask for help reaching certain shelves. At night, after she left, the condo would feel too large. Ocean sounds were soothing until they weren't. Sleep didn't come easily. When it did, it came with images I couldn't control. Headlights bearing down. Tires losing traction. The moment of weightlessness before impact. I'd jerk awake, heart hammering, breath sawing, hands clutching the sheets. Those episodes started to repeat, an echo built into my nights. Sometimes I'd hear myself make a small sound, not quite a cry, but not silence either. A low, startled noise. If Lydia was staying over, she'd sometimes knock gently in the morning, asking if I'd slept okay. I'd shrug it off, say I was fine, just restless. New meds made dreams too vivid. It was easier than watching worry bloom in her face. This pattern settled into the rhythm of my new life. Therapy appointments. Physical therapy. Trips to the downstairs cafe where May would slide a coffee across the counter and tell me about her grandchildren, while I tried not to flinch every time a car backfired. On the surface, it probably looked like resilience. A woman who took a devastating injury and carved out a stable existence. Underneath, there were cracks. I felt them when a siren screamed too close. When a stranger pushed past my chair without apologizing. When I saw families walking hand in hand along the harbor. Lydia remained my anchor through most of it. She called often, texted memes, photos of cakes. She complained about long hours. None of those things would have been remarkable on their own. Together, they formed a shape I could no longer iron difficult clients, but there was a lightness in her voice. Then she started talking about a man she'd met through work. Someone smart and funny, who understood contracts better than anyone. She described how he listened, how he made her feel safe, like she didn't have to worry about practical details because he always had a plan. At the time, those words sounded like a blessing. After everything we'd been through, I wanted her to have someone kind. I didn't yet know that the same traits that made him seem so responsible in her eyes would look very different in mine. There's a certain irony in how my own trauma became the tool he'd later use. The nights I startled awake. The bad dreams. The moments my voice shook when I told Lydia I was fine. Those private vulnerabilities eventually spun into a story about a woman who couldn't be trusted with her own life. In a way, the accident didn't stop hitting me when the car stopped moving. Its shockwaves kept traveling outward, touching people and choices years later. But back then, in those quieter months, I was just a woman in recovery, doing my best to build a new routine out of broken pieces. I didn't yet know how much of my life had been noted, studied. How my sister's new boyfriend would file away every small detail. I didn't know he'd read the article about the injured agent, the large settlement. That he'd already pictured Harborline Towers before he ever shook my hand. All I knew was I was tired, hopeful, and trying to trust that the worst was behind us. One afternoon, Lydia showed up at my condo with a brightness in her face I hadn't seen in a long time. She wore a pale blue dress that swayed when she walked, talking so fast I had to remind her to breathe. She'd met someone at a corporate event, a paralegal who helped her sort out a last-minute contract issue. He was smart and calm, she said, making everything feel manageable. When she spoke about him, something softened in her expression. My heart lifted. After all she'd endured, I wanted her to have someone good. He came by about a week later. Lydia had invited him for coffee so I could meet him. He arrived exactly on time, carrying a small box of pastries, placing it on my kitchen counter with a polite smile. He thanked me for letting him visit, said I had a beautiful place, asked how long I'd lived there. His voice was warm, steady, practiced. Not fake, exactly, more like someone experienced at putting others at ease. If I'd met him under different circumstances, I might have thought he was genuinely thoughtful. He sat across from me at the small dining table, turning his coffee mug in his hands as Lydia talked about her week. Occasionally, he'd add a detail, something supportive or gently teasing. He asked me about rehab, if the building was comfortable, about the view. Harmless questions, on the surface. But even then, I noticed how his eyes flicked around the condo with a kind of evaluation, not admiration, not curiosity, but calculation. As if taking inventory of more than just furniture. I brushed the thought aside. People look around. I told myself I was being overly sensitive, that years in the bureau had hardwired me to look for things that weren't always there. I'd been trying so hard to stop seeing every stranger as a potential threat. It was a habit that kept me alive in one world, but it was exhausting in this new one. As summer moved in, Bronson became a regular figure. Picking Lydia up from the lobby, meeting her at the cafe. I often saw them from my balcony, his hand lightly on her back, his head seemingly attentive. Charming, but not showy. Even May at the cafe commented on how put together he seemed. Kindly face, she said, and always tips well. Small details that shape impressions quickly in a building like ours. One morning, I went downstairs for coffee. May greeted me with her usual warmth, handing me my order. Then she asked if I'd been sleeping all right. I paused, caught off guard. She said Lydia had mentioned I sometimes made noises in my sleep, that I might still be having nightmares. She asked if I ever woke up disoriented, or if I had someone checking on me. A knot tightened in my throat. This didn't feel random. It felt planted. I told her I was fine, just adjusting to new medication. She nodded, that gentle, worried way older women do when they're not sure they should push. It lingered, even as I rolled out of the cafe toward the elevator. I pushed the button, listening to the quiet hum of the building. Mr. Johnson, a middle-aged man who usually kept to himself, passed me. He slowed down just a little and asked if everything was all right in my unit. He said it seemed weak. That struck me as strange. I'm meticulous about security. Trauma sharpens habits like locking doors. I never left my door unsecured. I told him I hadn't, and he gave a small, awkward smile before walking away. The elevator ride felt longer than usual. I replayed his question again and again. Something was off about the phrasing, like he was repeating something he'd been told, not something he'd seen. When I reached my floor, the hallway felt different. Not physically, but the energy had shifted, as if whispers had trailed through it. People in buildings like ours talk. They notice struggles, changed routines. And if someone wanted to shape a narrative about my mental stability, this was the perfect environment to sow seeds. I unlocked my door, rolled inside, and closed it behind me. For a moment, I stayed still, letting the quiet settle. The condo felt familiar and safe, yet a sliver of unease had found its way in. Had Lydia mentioned my rough nights to anyone else? Had I said something half awake? It was possible, but the timing felt too deliberate. 2 conversations in one morning, touching the same nerve, both wrapped in concern, but threaded with implication. I went to the balcony. The sun reflected off the water in shimmering strips. A couple walked along the pier, talking quietly. The world looked calm and predictable from up here. But inside my mind, a quiet alarm had begun to ring. I thought back to Bronson's first visit. The way he glanced at my medical equipment. The way he lingered over the framed news article about my accident. His gentle questions about adjusting, about feeling overwhelmed alone. Bronson had access to legal knowledge, guardianships, power of attorney, the subtle language that suggests someone needs oversight. If he'd been planting ideas quietly through Lydia, through casual conversations with neighbors, through harmless remarks, then what I'd felt as unease might have been something much more intentional. I rolled back inside, sat near the counter, My hand wrapped around the warm coffee May had given me. My heart wasn't racing, but it was alert, tuned like an instrument to the smallest shift in tone. Something was happening. Something I hadn't invited, but that had been carefully set in motion. And if I was right, the worried questions weren't random. They were rehearsal lines in a story someone was trying to tell about me. I knew then that it was time to pay close attention. To watch what Bronson said. To listen not just to my sister's words, but the weight behind them. To trace the shape forming in the shadows before it solidified into something harder to undo. The accident had taken my legs, but it hadn't taken my instincts. The next morning, I rolled into my living room with a kind of steady focus I hadn't felt since my bureau days. My condo had always been a refuge, a place where the harbor sounds and city pulse mixed into something healing. Now, I looked at the walls differently. The entryway. The hallway. Any point of access where someone with the wrong intentions could slip in unnoticed. I had no desire to become paranoid again. But I also knew how manipulation began. Always quietly. People like Bronson never lunged. They tiptoed. They asked harmless questions. They presented concern as care. And if no one questioned them, their confidence grew until they caused irreparable damage. So, I went back to my training, piece by piece. I started with camera installation. Nothing expensive or dramatic, just high-quality devices that blended in. One in the hallway pointed toward the front door. One in the foyer. Another near the bedroom entrance, high enough you'd never see it unless you knew exactly where to look. I set each to record continuously, transmitting footage to a secure cloud server that Bronson would never know existed. The last camera I placed near the window facing the internal corridor. I used to think those open-air hallways felt airy and safe. Now I watched them like an alley during surveillance, tracing movement, memorizing faces, learning patterns. I tested each camera, rolling out of frame, leaving the unit, confirming motion detection. When I finally sat back in my chair and viewed the synced feeds on my tablet, something subtle shifted inside me. I wasn't helpless. I wasn't off balance. I had tools. I had a strategy. Despite what Bronson hoped, my mind was clear. It only took 3 days for the first confirmation. I'd left for a physical therapy session and returned earlier than planned. When I accessed the hallway camera feed, there he was. Bronson. Standing outside my door. The footage showed him glancing left and right, then reaching into his pocket for something metallic. He stood there in clean, deliberate silence, inserting a key, cracking the door just enough to slip in, then pulling it shut behind him. My hand stayed steady on the tablet as I watched him move through my home. He walked with eerie confidence, like someone who'd already measured the space. He checked drawers, paused near my bookshelf, then walked toward the bedroom hallway. He opened the small filing cabinet beside my desk. Sifted carefully through documents, replacing some, moving others slightly. He was looking for paperwork. Ownership documents. Settlement papers. Anything that could be twisted into the narrative he was building. He closed the drawer, smoothed the surface, and left without taking anything. He was scouting. He wasn't finished yet. When Lydia came over that evening, she had no idea. She talked about work, about a demanding wedding client, about a coworker volunteering her for things she hadn't agreed to. Then she mentioned Bronson had borrowed her spare key earlier that afternoon to check on a delivery at his place. Click. He'd used her kindness against her, without hesitation. I waited until she'd gone home, then pulled out an old contact notebook. I hadn't touched it in years. Near the back were names I used to call often. One was Dorian Hale. Dorian worked with me at the Bureau, in counterintelligence. He had a talent for details, especially written ones. He could look at handwriting like a biologist looks at cell structures, tracing patterns with startling precision. After I left, he moved into private consulting for law firms. We exchanged holiday messages, but rarely more. I called him anyway. When he answered, his voice carried the same mix of dry humor and sharp intelligence. He asked how I was holding up. I told him I needed a favor. He said he owed me more than one. I emailed him a handful of documents Lydia had brought over a few days earlier. She said Bronson found them through a colleague, that they were supposed to help her organize financial matters in case anything ever happened to me. I remembered feeling uneasy at the time because the wording was vague, and the signature sections had too many preparatory clauses. Now I saw them clearly for what they were: preparatory steps toward a guardianship claim or a transfer of authority. Dorian called me back that same night. He asked if I was sitting down. "The chair's a permanent part of my life now," I told him. "So, yes, technically." He told me the signatures weren't mine. Very close. Close enough that someone unfamiliar with my writing would believe them. But not exact. The slope of certain letters was off. The pressure pattern inconsistent with my dominant hand. He said whoever forged them had legal knowledge but not artistic skill. The signature range of paralegals who learned forgery through exposure rather than training. My stomach went cold. Could this hold up in court? I asked. "Absolutely not," he said. "Flawed enough, any handwriting specialist would detect fabrication." He asked if I wanted an official report. "Not yet," I said. I needed to understand the full scope of what Bronson was building. After the call, I sat in the dim light of my living room for a long time. Harborline Towers always felt safe. Now the air inside my unit felt heavier. I thought back to the news articles after my settlement. The local paper ran a feature about my service, my injury, the community support. Photos, me before a row of flags, me in my wheelchair accepting a certificate. Anyone with enough time and curiosity could find those stories. Anyone with a certain kind of ambition could follow the trail. If they discovered I had one younger sister, no other family, was financially stable but physically vulnerable, then my life would look like an opportunity. I hadn't wanted to believe Bronson targeted us. But now, watching the pieces fall into place, there was no other explanation. I turned off the main lights. Only the soft glow from the balcony filtered into the room. I took a deep breath, held it, released it. Bronson wasn't just manipulating Lydia. He was constructing a narrative about me. Preparing evidence. Testing access to my home. Forging signatures. Planting concerns in the community. Laying the groundwork for something bigger. And I knew then that if I didn't act quickly and precisely, he would take everything I had left. The hardest part? Knowing Lydia still believed he loved her. That she had no idea she'd been chosen long before she ever offered him her first smile. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of that truth. Then I opened them again, with the calm of someone who'd rebuilt themselves from the ground up before, and could do it again. I had the cameras, the footage, the handwriting analysis. The picture was forming clearly. Now I needed to decide how to use it. How far I was willing to go to stop the man who thought he'd already figured out how to own my life. The answer came sooner than I expected. 2 days after my call with Dorian, I was home on a slow Tuesday afternoon. The sky over the harbor was that soft marine layer, making everything look silver. A physical therapy session had canceled, so I was catching up on emails. My legs covered with a light blanket, my chair angled so I could see both the water and the front door. Asterisk knock, knock, knock. Pause. Knock, knock. Asterisk 3 quick taps, then 2 more. A pattern. Bronson did everything with a pattern. I rolled to the door, checked the peephole. He stood there alone, wearing a polo shirt and jeans, holding a slim black folder and a small toolkit. His expression, the picture of polite concern. For a moment, I considered not answering, pretending I was out. But avoidance becomes surrender, and I refused to give him that satisfaction. I opened the door enough to meet his eyes. He told me he'd gotten a call from Lydia. She'd mentioned I'd spoken about some flickering lights in the hallway last week. And since he knew a little about electrical systems, he thought he'd drop by. I had never said anything to Lydia about flickering lights. I told him the condo was fine, the building manager handled issues. He insisted, gently. He didn't want me worrying about things that could be dangerous. After everything I'd been through, I didn't need one more stress, he said. What could I say without sounding ungrateful or hostile? People like Bronson count on that hesitation, the way decent people don't want to seem rude. So, I stepped back and let him in. My face calm. My mind sharp. I'd positioned one camera high in the living room, angled toward the entryway and my desk. As he walked past, I mentally checked its field of view. He was perfectly captured. He did a quick, half-hearted check of the recessed lights, touching the switch, glancing up. Then, almost casually, he drifted toward my desk. He asked if my laptop ever gave me trouble, if the outlet had issues. Before I could answer, he was there, reaching behind the desk, fiddling with the power strip. Anyone else might think he was checking connections. I knew better. His eyes kept sliding toward the small filing cabinet beside the desk, the one he'd rifled through last time. I told myself to stay still, to let him show himself. He straightened up, mentioned that power surges could affect electronics, asked if he could move a few things to get a better sense of where the cables were. I nodded, watched him pull my desk chair aside. He rested a hand on the file cabinet, as if using it to balance. Then he opened the top drawer with the same casual motions someone uses to scratch an itch. He didn't realize I'd rearranged everything after his last visit. Neatly labeled folders. Copies of my settlement documents. My official ID from the bureau. Tax returns. He flipped through them with practiced fingers, pausing a little too long on anything mentioning account numbers or property details. I sat a few feet away, hands folded, face neutral. Inside, my thoughts ticked, one by one, like an old safe dial. He asked if I'd ever thought about simplifying that paperwork. Said with my medical history, it might make sense to put certain things in a structure that would protect me if anything happened. The way he said, if anything happened, landed like a pebble tossed into a still pond. I asked what he meant. He launched into what I'm sure he thought was a reassuring explanation. He finished checking the outlet, put the few folders back, slightly out of alignment, and then spoke about trusts, family entities, shared decision-making. His tone stayed light, conversational, as if discussing recipes instead of legal control. He said with me living alone, dealing with trauma, giving Lydia and him some authority could help. Make things simpler if my health ever declined. He didn't say if my mind ever declined, but the implication hung right there. After he left, I waited until the door shut and his footsteps faded. Then I rolled back to my desk and opened the camera feeds. I watched the scene again, this time with the distance of a third-person observer. It was all there. His pretext about the lights. His hand on the file cabinet. His quick scan of the labels. His little speech about trusts. Later that week, Lydia came for dinner. Pasta. Salad. We ate at the table, the balcony door cracked open. She seemed a little distracted, twisting her napkin as she talked. Halfway through, she cleared her throat. Said she wanted to ask me something, but didn't want me to take it the wrong way. My stomach tightened, but my voice stayed level. Go ahead, I said. She said she and Bronson had been talking about my future. Exactly how she phrased it. She worried about how much stress I carried. The bills. Condo security. Investments. She reminded me I'd been through so much, deserved to rest. Then she repeated, almost word for word, what Bronson had said about shared responsibility. She said Bronson knew all kinds of options in the legal world, worked with lawyers who helped families in situations like mine. Maybe we should set up something where they can help manage things so you wouldn't have to. The words hung in the air, out of her mouth, but with his fingerprints all over them. I asked gently if she worried I wasn't capable of keeping up with my own life. She rushed to say no, it wasn't like that. She knew I was smart and organized. She just didn't want me to feel alone. Then she added something that cut more deeply than she probably realized. She said sometimes I did seem a little forgetful, especially after a bad night. Maybe it would be a relief to have help. It's a strange thing, hearing your own vulnerability used as evidence against you, even when wrapped in concern. I looked at her across the table. This young woman I'd raised since she was 11. This person whose scraped knees I'd bandaged, whose tears I'd wiped away. She truly believed she was protecting me. She trusted Bronson so completely that his suggestions felt like her own ideas. I realized in that moment just how deeply he had woven himself into her. It wasn't enough for him to use my trauma. He was using her love for me, bending it, twisting it, pointing it back at me as justification. I told her I appreciated her caring. I told her I'd think about it. That seemed to calm her. She relaxed, talking about work again. But the damage had been done. The seed had been planted, and I knew exactly where it came from. A few days later, a piece of mail arrived that made everything even clearer. A thick envelope, addressed not to me, but to something called Dollar Family Trust, LLC. The return address belonged to a financial services firm specializing in managing properties for families who, as their glossy brochures put it, needed a sophisticated approach to wealth protection. I held that envelope, felt its non-physical weight. The company name, my last name embedded without my permission, the implication that some entity already existed to hold my assets. I had never authorized anything like that. I opened it carefully. Inside, a welcome packet thanking Dollar Family Trust LLC for choosing their firm. References to upcoming consultations about real estate and investment portfolios. Language about consolidating holdings. Nowhere did my full name appear as a person. Only as part of the trust. I could almost see Bronson, sitting somewhere with a laptop, filling out online forms, using enough information about me from old news articles to construct something that looked legitimate. He wasn't guessing anymore. He'd moved from reconnaissance to structure building. I gathered the documents and placed them in a new folder, one marked very clearly in my mind as Preparation for War. He had shown his hand. He wasn't just thinking about controlling some of my decisions. He was preparing to move my home and my settlement money into a container he controlled. A legal shell with my family name on it, designed to make theft look like management. Standing there in my kitchen, the harbor light fading outside, that envelope open in front of me, I felt a familiar coldness settle in my chest. Not fear. Not exactly anger. A focused, almost clinical resolve. He had made his move. Now it was my turn. Those words stayed with me long after I left her office, echoing in my mind the whole drive back to Harbor Line Towers. The late afternoon sun was still bright, catching the tops of masts, scattering gold across the water. I felt the warmth through the window as I rolled inside my condo. But underneath that warmth was something tighter, more braced. The kind of feeling I used to get before a high-risk interview, when everything depended on staying calm and letting the truth rise on its own. I'd spent the morning with Maribel Stone, one of the sharpest probate attorneys in San Diego. She listened without interruption as I laid out the timeline, the forged signatures, the LLC envelope, the camera footage, the pattern of manipulation. When I finished, she leaned back, thoughtful, like someone rearranging puzzle pieces that already made sense. She confirmed what I'd suspected. Bronson was circling incompetency claims, setting up a shell company, already dabbling in forgery. She told me a man like him rarely moved without expecting to hold advantage. The only way to beat him was to remove that advantage before he reached it. Which is exactly what we did yesterday. We built a special needs asset protection trust, designed specifically for people with long-term disabilities, to shield their financial assets from exploitation. Within that structure, my condo no longer appeared in my name. My accounts were transferred under the trust registration. Every document refiled, sealed by the San Diego County Probate Court. Stamped. Protected. I retained full authority, but no one else could invoke guardianship attempts against me without hitting legal concrete. Bronson thought he was one step away from taking what was mine. He was actually walking into a wall I had built in a single afternoon. When the clerk handed Maribel the stamped order, the reality of it hit me more deeply than I expected. My condo. The settlement I'd fought so hard to rebuild my life with. The savings I'd guarded. No longer vulnerable to anyone's scheme. Especially not his. I rolled across the condo, letting my fingertips brush the back of the sofa. I could hear faint laughter from the pool deck below. The splash of water. The distant hum of a boat motor. Everything looked so ordinary. And yet, under the surface, everything had changed. I went to the balcony, let the ocean air wash over me. The scent of salt pulled old memories forward. Dad driving us down the coast. Mom laughing. Lydia, a child, eating orange slices. I could almost hear Dad calling out directions. Grief comes in layers. It never really leaves, but sometimes it offers a moment of quiet reminder. Standing there, I felt their absence and their presence at once. It made me even more certain I couldn't let someone like Bronson touch anything connected to our name. My phone buzzed. A text from Lydia. She might stop by later if I was free, just to talk. My heart tightened. Not out of fear, but sadness. She had no idea what she was caught in. No idea the man she believed was looking out for her had been looking at my life like a spreadsheet to be reorganized. I texted back that she was welcome. Then I moved to the living room, opened my laptop, and reviewed the camera feeds again. Not because I needed more evidence, but because watching the precision of his intrusions reminded me that he had made his decision long before any of us recognized it. The footage from last week, him entering with her spare key, pausing at the filing cabinet, opening drawers with a confidence that didn't belong to someone just checking on electrical issues. His steps were deliberate. His focus exact. He believed no one would ever question him. I clicked through the recording slowly. My spine prickled, the way it used to before operations that required patience more than force. I thought about the outline Maribel had drawn. The legal protections now in place. It felt like someone had locked a steel door behind me. Not one that trapped me inside, but one that ensured no one could push their way through again. As evening settled, Lydia arrived. She let herself in with the soft knock she'd used since she was a girl. When she stepped into the living room, she looked tired, shoulders drawn up, as if holding a weight she didn't understand. Her eyes flicked instantly to my chair, then to the table where some documents were spread out. She hesitated. I asked how she was. She sat on the edge of the sofa, twisting her fingers in her lap, the way she always did when something troubled her. She mentioned Bronson seemed stressed lately, busy, preoccupied. He'd been talking more about planning for the future, about responsibilities, about making sure everything was handled properly if something ever happened. There it was again. That phrase. Those quiet, rehearsed lines. I asked her gently if she ever felt like he wanted control, not help. She blinked, confused, shook her head. She said he just cared. Said he just wanted what was best for us. The ache in my chest deepened. She meant it. I changed the subject before her worry grew. We talked about her week, a wedding venue near La Jolla, a catering disaster narrowly avoided. She made me laugh, and for a moment, the air around us felt normal again. Later, when she left, I watched from the balcony as she crossed the street. She paused at the curb, looked up at my unit. Her expression was unreadable, but something about the tilt of her head made my heart twist. I had protected her since she was 11. Stepped into the role Mom and Dad left behind. Losing her trust, even briefly, felt like losing a part of myself. I turned back inside, rolled to the kitchen island where the trust documents were neatly stacked. I placed my palm lightly on them. These pages weren't only legal protection. They were the boundary I'd never expected to need against someone who'd married into my family. I closed the folder, slid it into the drawer. Then I sat quietly, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the faint groan of the building settling for the night. The lights from the harbor flickered across the ceiling. Maribel had been right. Everything was in place. The court had sealed the trust yesterday. The transfers were complete. The structure was solid. Now all that remained was to wait for the moment Bronson pushed too far. The moment he believed he had already won. The moment he walked directly into the trap he had no idea existed. The night before passed in that strange, slow way only sleepless nights can. I dozed in short stretches, never fully dropping into real rest. Every time my eyes closed, I saw Bronson in my living room again, heard his voice saying I wouldn't see a single penny, that this condo belonged to him. When I did sleep, I dreamed in fragments. Dad driving down the coast. Mom laughing. Lydia as a child clutching my arm. I woke up more than once gripping the mattress, the ocean and city folding into a low hum. By the time the security alarm went off at 5 a.m., I was already half awake. The first thing I saw wasn't the ceiling, or the blinds, or even my own hands. It was the grainy but clear image from the lobby camera on my tablet. I'd set it to stay open beside my bed, a quiet window into Harbor Line Towers. The building system detected something unusual at the gate. The feed jumped. Headlights. A moving truck eased into the circle drive, big and white against the soft blue dawn. Its engine rumbled, that deep vibration heavy vehicles make. Behind it, a compact dark sedan followed. The lobby lights were still on night setting, a little dimmer. The glass doors slid open, and Trent stepped forward from the security desk, glancing toward whatever he could see through the windows. His posture was tight. He'd already called me a few moments earlier, his voice shaky, telling me Lydia and Bronson were downstairs with movers, insisting they owned my place. I'd told him to log them. Keep everything in the book. Now I watched it unfold, 12 floors up. 2 men climbed out of the truck, rubbing sleep from their faces, pulling jackets tighter against the chill. They slid the rear door up, revealing the empty space inside, waiting for someone else's life to be packed into it. The sight of that vacancy sent a strange shiver down my arms. Those men didn't know what they were stepping into. For them, just another job. The camera feed caught the sedan doors opening almost in sync. Bronson came around the front of the car, his stride smooth and confident. Dark coat, pressed shirt. Professional. In his hand, a thick folder. The same style he'd had when he visited. That folder had become his prop, his shield, his weapon. Lydia emerged from the passenger side, shoulders hunched inside a pale sweater, hair pulled back. From this angle, I couldn't see her face, but her body language spoke volumes. She lingered half a step behind him, hands wrapped around herself like she was trying to stay warm from more than just the morning air. Bronson reached back once, placed his hand on her shoulder. A gesture that might have been reassuring if I hadn't known him. To me, it looked like containment. They walked toward the entrance. Trent met them. No audio from this angle, but I could imagine the exchange. Identification. Explanation. Bronson's calm, authoritative tone. The hesitancy in Trent's eyes, caught between his uniform and his gut instincts. Bronson lifted the folder, fanned out documents with bold seals and neat lines. Pointed line by line, indicating supposed proof of ownership. He gestured toward the ceiling, then the elevators. The movers watched, shifting their weight, waiting for a signal. I watched Trent pick up the visitor logbook, his pen moving. Bronson Reeves. Lydia Reeves. The reason for visit, probably move in. Property transfer. Whatever words he used, I knew they'd be important later. Every stroke of Trent's handwriting was another strand in the web that would either trap me or protect me. This time, it would help me. On my bed, I shifted slightly, pulling the blanket farther over my legs. My heart was beating faster now, but not from panic. It was the steady, focused rush that comes when everything you've planned starts to line up. The lobby camera shifted as they moved toward the elevator. The movers carried dollies, stacks of flattened boxes. Bronson walked in front, speaking over his shoulder. Lydia followed, arms held close, gaze dropped to the floor. The elevator doors slid open. They all stepped inside. The view cut off as the metal closed. I switched to the feed inside the service corridor on the 12th floor. That camera captured the doors opening again, and the small cluster of people stepping out into the elegant hallway that led toward my condo. The building was quiet. Most residents still asleep. No one there to see this procession but me, watching from above. Bronson led the way, folder tucked under his arm. One mover pushed an empty dolly, wheels squeaking faintly. You could almost feel the weight of the silence, broken only by footsteps and the low rumble of the truck engines still idling below. When they reached my door, a strange mix of fury and grim satisfaction rose in me. That door had been a line of safety for so long. Now it was the line he believed he was crossing to claim victory. Trent had come up with them. The camera caught him standing a few feet back, his face cautious. He watched Bronson take out the stolen key again, then stop himself, as if remembering that today, he was supposed to be legitimate. Instead, Bronson held up the folder, flipped to the top page. Tapped it once. Looked at Trent with an expression that said, "Of course, this is all in order." I couldn't hear the words, but I could see his mouth forming the familiar phrases. Property transfer, deed, owner of record. He held the papers up like a magic trick, daring anyone to doubt them. The movers glanced at each other, as if asking, "Are we doing this?" One shrugged, clearly more concerned with being paid than with property law. Bronson turned back to my door, pushed the key into the lock, this time in full view of the guard and the camera, and opened it as if he were stepping into a place that already belonged to him. I switched to the inside feed, the camera in my living room facing the entryway. The door swung open. Bronson walked in with a self-satisfaction that almost made me physically ill. The movers followed, looking around with quick, measuring eyes. Lydia lingered at the threshold. For a long moment, she didn't cross into the condo. She stood, fingers gripping her purse strap, staring at the familiar space. I saw the recognition in her posture. Every corner meant something to her. Nights on that couch. Dinners at that table. Her first real promotion, celebrated with cheap champagne. In this very room. Bronson reached back, touched her elbow, guiding her in as if she were a reluctant guest instead of family. He snapped instructions to the movers, his tone brisk and controlled. Pointed toward the bedroom and living room. A sweeping gesture, clearly meaning start with the big pieces. I watched one mover head down the hallway toward my room. The other began measuring the sofa with his eyes. Standing in my quiet bedroom, hidden from all of them, I kept my attention on the screen. The tension in my neck and shoulders tightened, but my breath stayed even. This was the moment everything had been designed for. Either the legal protections we'd put in place would intersect with his arrogance, or they wouldn't. There was nothing left for me to adjust. The movers at the bedroom door called something back to Bronson, and he waved his hand impatiently, giving permission without even looking. That small display of disregard told me everything about how he viewed my space. I wasn't a person to him now. I was an obstacle on a checklist he believed he'd already overcome. As the movers opened the door to my living room fully and began discussing how to get the furniture through it, the air in the condo seemed to shift. The harbor outside was pale gold now, the sky lightening from blue to soft peach. The city was waking up, people making coffee, turning on news programs, stepping into showers, having no idea what was happening. On the 12th floor of a building by that water. I sat there in the shadows of my bedroom, the laptop screen glowing softly, and watched as strangers made their first moves toward dismantling the life I'd built. They thought. In reality, every step they took brought us all closer to the moment when Bronson would find out that the story he had written was not the one that would stand. The first sign that the tide was turning wasn't dramatic. It was a small flicker in the corner of my tablet screen, where the exterior camera feed sat. A dark shape pulled into the drive behind the moving truck. Smaller, quieter. The outline of a patrol car, the familiar blue and white markings of the San Diego Police Department. Its headlights washed over the back of the moving truck, then dimmed as the engine shut off. I could almost feel Trent's relief through the camera. He stood near the lobby entrance, arms folded, watching the movers. When the patrol car doors opened, and 2 officers stepped out, he moved toward the glass doors as if a pressure inside his chest had finally found a release valve. One officer was a woman in her 40s, compact and steady, her dark hair pulled back, her expression neutral, but alert. The other, a younger man, tall, scanning the scene with the cautious curiosity of someone still learning how quickly situations can shift. The older officer spoke briefly with Trent. He gestured upward, toward the upper floors, toward the moving truck, toward the visitor logbook on his desk. This was the part Maribel and I had planned. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would tip our hand too early. Just a quiet note from building management that something felt wrong. An unannounced move. A resident someone thought was out of town, but not officially. A key that hadn't been cleared. Enough red flags to justify a welfare check. On my screen, I watched the officers ride the elevator up with Trent. The movers continued gathering boxes, not yet aware that anything was different. Bronson was in my living room, explaining to one of the men how he wanted the larger furniture angled in the truck. Lydia stood near the dining table, fingers pressed to her lips, looking anywhere but at the sofa they were about to take. The service corridor camera captured the elevator doors opening onto my floor again. The officers stepped out first, Trent following. The younger one adjusted his belt, resting his hand near his radio. The older one took in the hallway at a glance, her gaze landing on the open door of my condo and the strange half-scene beyond, movers hovering over someone else's belongings before sunrise. She walked forward with a measured pace and stopped just outside my doorway. From my bedroom, hidden but watching, I saw her raise a hand slightly, a polite, firm gesture. "What's going on?" she asked. Her voice carried just enough for the living room microphone to pick up. Bronson turned, the practiced smile already on his face, the deed folder tucked under his arm like a passport to anywhere he wanted to go. He greeted her as if this were an inconvenience, nothing more. Said they were simply completing a move-in. Said he had the deed and transfer papers right there if she needed proof. He sounded so sure of himself that for a moment, if I hadn't known better, even I might have believed him. The officer asked to see the documents. She stepped just inside the living room, careful not to cross too far before she understood the claim. Bronson opened the folder with a small flourish, holding out the papers he'd waved at Trent earlier. A thick stack, heavy with legal language and counterfeit authority. She took her time. Didn't rush. Didn't let his confident commentary distract her. The camera caught the way her eyes lingered on the notary seal. The way her brow creased slightly as she traced the registration number. She flipped to the recorded deed, the one that supposedly transferred ownership of my condo into his hands. She asked where the notary was registered. Bronson replied without missing a beat, saying something about an out-of-county contact who handled things quickly for his firm. Everything had been done properly. The seller had signed willingly. He gestured vaguely toward my hallway as if I might appear as a supporting actor. The officer didn't smile. "Are you aware," she asked, "that notaries who notarize California real estate transactions have to be properly registered? And their commission numbers are easily verifiable." She mentioned that the registration number on the seal didn't match any active notary she knew of. That small sentence hung in the air like a crack of lightning. I saw color drain slightly from his face before he caught himself. She also mentioned something else. She said property records showed that this unit was currently held in a special needs asset protection trust that had been filed and sealed with the probate court very recently. How do your documents account for that? That was Maribel Stone's work, looping the police into the outline just enough that if a patrol car ever responded to my address, they wouldn't walk in blind. Bronson faltered for the first time. "There must be a mistake," he stammered. "The trust is out of date. The woman who lives here, she doesn't understand what she signed. She needs guidance. My wife and I are stepping in to help her." He started to repeat the same phrases he'd used with Lydia. Asterisk, not competent. Under stress. Needs protection. Asterisk, I chose that moment to move. I rolled my chair out of the bedroom doorway, down the hallway, into view. The living room camera caught the shift in everyone's posture. The instant they saw me, the movers froze, their hands still on the edges of my furniture. Lydia turned so fast her hair slipped from its knot. Her eyes wide, something between hope and dread. Bronson's jaw tightened visibly before he smoothed his expression. The officer looked at me. "Are you the resident of this unit?" "I am the legal owner," I said, "and my name is on the trust documents you just referenced." My voice sounded calm, even to my own ears. Years of training and months of planning had led to this exact moment. There was no room left for fear. She asked if I had given consent for this move. "No," I stated plainly. "I have not. I have never sold my condo. I have never authorized any transfer of ownership to Dollar Family Trust LLC, or to Bronson, or to anyone else. I have not hired this moving company, and I never agreed to vacate my home." The younger officer moved a step closer to the movers, telling them to hold off on touching anything else until things were clarified. One of the men lifted his hands off the sofa as if it were suddenly too hot. The other quietly nudged the dolly back a few inches. I turned my chair slightly toward the older officer. "I have evidence," I told her. "Over the past weeks, Bronson has entered my unit without permission, using a stolen key. I have video of him going through my drawers while I was gone. I have audio of him speaking about how I would never see a single penny for my settlement, how this condo would belong to him. I also received mail for Dollar Family Trust LLC at my address, a company I never formed," I continued. "A friend of mine with forensic training has examined signatures on documents Bronson tried to introduce, and those signatures were proven to be forged. Maribel Stone, my attorney, has already filed my trust with the court and can confirm that any deed he is presenting is fraudulent and in conflict with recorded property records." I spoke steadily, each statement simple, factual, the way we were taught to deliver critical information under pressure. The officer listened without interrupting. Then she asked if I had copies. I reached to the small table beside my chair, where I had placed a neat stack of folders before all this began. I handed them to her, one by one. Video stills printed with timestamps. A summary letter from Dorian about the signature analysis. A copy of the fraudulent welcome packet. A copy of the court order establishing my Special Needs Asset Protection Trust. Her eyes moved over each page with increasing focus. The room was so quiet I could hear Lydia's unsteady breathing. Bronson tried to cut in. "She's confused," he sputtered. "Trauma has affected her memory. She agreed to some parts of the plan but can't remember." He reached toward Lydia as if to pull her into his narrative. She flinched away, for the first time. Her gaze moved between my face, the officers, and the papers. She asked him, in a small, shaking voice, "Why did you tell me she was losing track of things? Why did you tell me she'd end up hurting herself with bad decisions if we didn't step in?" Her words cracked halfway through, as if each one cost her something. He answered that he had only wanted to protect me, that everything he had done was for family. The older officer straightened, the folder still in her hands. "From where I'm standing," she said, her voice clear and cutting, "what I see looks less like protection and more like a calculated attempt to take control of assets that do not belong to you." She mentioned forgery, fraud, possible attempted grand theft, given the value of the property and the known settlement for my accident. She added one more phrase that sent a chill even through me: abuse of a dependent adult. I've never loved that term, dependent adult. It makes people like me sound helpless. But at that moment, I understood its power when used correctly. It meant the law recognized that my disability made me a target in certain eyes. That exploiting that was not just ugly, it was criminal. She stepped closer to Bronson. "Do you have anything else you'd like to show me?" she asked, very calmly. "Any proof that contradicts the court records? Any legitimate notary confirmation? Any document signed in front of a registered witness?" His mouth opened, then closed. For the first time since he walked into my life, he seemed to understand that his confidence would not carry him out of this room. The younger officer moved behind him. The movers had backed almost all the way out to the hallway, their eyes wide. One of them said quietly they just wanted to leave. They had no idea there was any dispute. The younger officer told them they were free to go. Their involvement would be noted as witnesses only. They practically ran for the door, muttering apologies. Lydia took a step toward me, then stopped halfway. Tears were already slipping down her cheeks. She looked at Bronson with a mixture of disbelief and dawning horror. She asked him, her voice shaking, "Did you ever truly love me, or was I just part of the plan?" She said he'd told her over and over that I didn't know what I was doing, that she needed to sign things to keep me safe, that if she loved me, she would help move everything into his hands. He didn't answer. Or if he did, the words were low and desperate, drowned out by the sound of the older officer speaking quietly into her radio, requesting confirmation from dispatch about the notary registration, about the trust, about the prior report Maribel had filed on my behalf. She ended the call, nodded once to herself, then turned back to Bronson. "Mr. Reeves," she said, "you are being detained on suspicion of forgery, fraud, attempted grand theft, and abuse of a dependent adult." She told him anything he said could and would be used as evidence, and that he had the right to remain silent. The familiar cadence of those words filled the room, a litany I'd heard before, now aimed at someone who believed himself untouchable. The younger officer gently took hold of Bronson's wrists. The metallic click of the cuffs sounded loud in the quiet condo. Lydia let out a sound, a broken half-sob that made my entire chest ache. He twisted his head toward me as they started to lead him out. No charm left in his face now. Only rage, and something that looked a lot like fear. "You set me up," he snarled. "You planned this. None of it will hold." I met his eyes. "I protected myself," I told him simply. That was all. As the officers guided him toward the door, the older one paused beside my chair. She told me someone from the department's financial crimes unit would be in touch, that my attorney would receive the full report, that I had done the right thing by documenting everything. When they left, the condo fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the distant sounds of the city waking up and Lydia's quiet, shaking breaths. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The door had closed behind Bronson. The cuffs had taken his hands away from my belongings. But the shock of what almost happened still hung in the air. We were finally safe. But nothing about this felt simple. Lydia stood in the middle of my living room, her hands trembling. The early morning light had reached the windows by then, softening the room, making everything look gentler than it felt. Her face was pale, her eyes distant, as if her mind were trying to rearrange the last hour into something that made sense. She finally looked at me. Not at my wheelchair. Not at the scattered papers still lying on the table where I'd shown the officers the evidence. But at me. Her sister. The girl who had raised her. The woman she had trusted and doubted in the same breath, because someone else had whispered the right lies in the right order. She walked toward me slowly, like she was approaching something fragile. When she reached me, she knelt beside my chair and rested her forehead on my knee. Her whole body shook as she started to cry. Not loud. Not dramatic. But with the quiet grief of someone who finally understood the depth of the betrayal she had lived under. I placed my hand gently on the back of her head, brushing her hair the way I used to when she was small and woke from nightmares. After a moment, she whispered that she was sorry. Again and again. Sorry for believing him. Sorry for repeating his words back to me. Sorry for nearly helping him take the last pieces of our life that Mom and Dad left us. I told her she had nothing to apologize for. Manipulators don't need intelligence or kindness to work. They need vulnerability. They need love. They need someone who tries to see the good in others, the way she always had. None of that was her fault. We stayed like that for a long while. Her kneeling, me holding her, the condo finally quiet again. The days that followed were a blur of statements and confirmations. The SPD took the footage. They interviewed Trent and the movers. Verified the forged notary number. The falsified deed. The LLC filings tied to Bronson's email. Every thread he'd pulled on unraveled under scrutiny. Every lie he'd crafted folded in on itself. He was charged with forgery, fraud, attempted grand theft, and abuse of a dependent adult. His arraignment came quickly. The court read out the accusations in a tone so dry and factual it almost removed the emotional weight of it all. But not quite. Lydia sat beside me in the gallery, her hands clasped, shoulders stiff. He glared at both of us when he was led out, as if we had undone some great design, rather than simply defending ourselves. But that glare held no power anymore. It was only the last flicker of a man cornered by his own ambition. When the restraining order was finalized, Lydia exhaled like she'd been holding her breath for months. Within 2 weeks, she filed for divorce. She moved out of their apartment, packed her clothes, her work supplies, and one worn-out shoebox of childhood mementos she'd forgotten she still kept. Then she moved into a small rental 5 minutes from my building, close enough that she could stop by after work, or on nights when the silence of her place felt too large. She told me she felt embarrassed. Foolish for falling for him. Ashamed she didn't see what he was doing sooner. I told her that shame belonged entirely to him. The human heart is not weak because it trusts. It is human. The district attorney contacted me twice more for updates, but the case moved forward without complications. Fraud is one thing. Forgery is another. Attempting to seize the assets of a disabled woman after entering her home with a stolen key while recording himself admitting his intentions? Prosecutors rarely see such clarity. Life began settling again, slowly, like dust after a storm. For the first time in months, I felt something inside me begin to loosen. I started rolling my chair out onto the balcony every morning, the way I used to. The ocean air always carried a mix of salt and diesel from the harbor, a scent that felt oddly comforting. Boats drifted out into the channel. Gulls wheeled lazily overhead. People walked the marina path with coffee cups in hand, unaware of how close I had come to losing the home that held all the memories I had left of my parents. One morning, while holding my mug and watching the light spread across the water, Lydia joined me. She leaned her elbows on the railing beside my chair and told me she had been thinking about everything that had happened. She said she wanted to do something meaningful with the experience. Something that made her feel less like a victim and more like someone who could protect others. Her words stayed with me. That afternoon, I sat at my desk and opened my laptop. And for the first time since the accident, I felt the old sense of purpose return. Not the bureau version of me, the one who combed surveillance reports, but the part of me that understood patterns, and people, and warning signs. I started by drafting a simple outline. A workshop. Nothing big at first. A discussion series for women about financial red flags, legal boundaries, and the subtle manipulation tactics that make even the smartest person doubt their own instincts. I called a community center near Harborline Towers and asked if they ever hosted educational sessions. The director said they'd love to. Within a month, I was speaking to groups of 15 or 20 women at a time, seated in a semicircle, my chair angled toward them. I talked about the tactics people like Bronson use. How they isolate. How they plant doubt. How they slowly frame control as protection. And how every woman deserves the knowledge and tools to guard her own life. The first time I stood at the front of that room, my chair angled toward the audience, I felt something shift. Strength isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it sits in a wheelchair with a stack of manila folders and a memory full of lessons carved by fire. Lydia came to every session she could. She volunteered to help organize sign-in sheets and refreshments. Watching her regain her clarity, her confidence, her warmth, reminded me that healing doesn't always require erasing what hurt us. Sometimes it requires understanding it deeply enough that we never let it happen again. Late one evening, weeks after the case had moved into its next phase, I found myself back on the balcony. The harbor was dark except for the soft twinkle of lights along the shore. The air felt cooler, the night stretching wide and calm. I sipped my coffee, letting the warmth settle in me, and thought about the long road from the accident to this moment. About the people who stepped into my life to harm me, and the people who stepped in to help. About the strength it took to stay patient when anger felt easier. And about how justice, when it finally arrives, rarely looks like vengeance. It looks like the truth. Solid enough to stand on. Revenge doesn't always require fury. Sometimes it only requires silence, timing, and one well-placed signature the day before everything comes crashing down. So tell me, have you ever had someone try to take advantage of your trust? What would you have done in my place? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.